Right, okay, I'm going to make a start because I think we could be here for 170 years. So, okay, for that, I'm going to introduce myself. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Stephanie and I am the Director of Teaching and Learning here at DSB Mumbai. And this morning I'm going to talk about balloon theory and how it can supercharge learning for students. Now, the first thing that I'd like to talk to you about is my career. Unfortunately, I'm not quite as young as I look, and I've been teaching for quite a long time. So I started off as an English teacher in 2003, which is pre-Libby, who sat there. So pre-Libby, and I decided that after I'd had my son, I was actually going to give in and become a teacher. So I did a few years there, and then I had the genius plan that instead of staying in lovely, leafy suburban East Yorkshire, I was going to move into inner city Hull. Now, for those of you, and I started a master's, and I'd had another baby by then. So life was pretty full. And I thought, well, how can I make my life more challenging? I'll start teaching in Hull. So Hull, if you don't know it very well, it's rather like Mumbai if it had no industry, no business, and nothing happening at all. Hull was flattened during World War II, so it has no more buildings. And hello, good morning. Yeah, so basically Hull was flattened during World War II. It's an incredibly deprived area. It has, what it is famous for is it has the highest teenage pregnancies in the whole of the UK. It has the lowest educational attainment in the whole of the UK. So Hull is a very deprived city, and it's at the end of the motorway, which means nobody goes to it. People just move away. So Hull was very difficult. And while I was in Hull, I decided I went to be an advanced skills teacher. That basically kept managers out of managing and kept people in the classroom, which was brilliant. I loved it. But from there, everything sort of happened, so to all of the rest of it. So from there, I went to local authority, and from the local authority, I then moved abroad, starting in Malaysia, where I was vice principal, then Russia, where I was deputy head, and now here, when I'm director of teaching and learning. But the most important thing was my very, very special class. So I want you to imagine it now. This is a new... it's a new academy in one of the most deprived areas. The old academy had to be knocked down. It had been condemned. There was no choice at all. There was, the year previous to me joining, the students had achieved 20% A stars to C, including English and maths. 20% is low. It's very, very low indeed. So 20% was a problem. So, but I had one particular class, and as a teacher, you teach hundreds upon hundreds of children, and I will confess that after a few years, they blur into each other. But I had this very special class who I will never, ever, ever, ever forget. This is an AI representation of my very special class, and it's very accurate. So, and I'm going to explain why. This was a bottom set of students. There were only 5 of them, but they were the most difficult students I have ever taught, ever. So I'm going to introduce you to my students. So, I'm not sure if you can see that. There was Bartosz. He was Lithuanian. He'd been in the country a whole week. He spoke no English whatsoever. He was terrified because he was at a school where older students ate younger students for breakfast. He was very scared. So that was Bartosz. Then I had Katya, and Katya was Russian. Katya's English was okay, but she came from a very troubled background with her mum. And she had many issues going on at home. But her English was okay. But she was the type of girl who put hearts above her eyes instead of a dot. She was that type of girl. She was lovely. Then there was Sophie. Sophie was in the care system, and Sophie was in the care system for an extremely good reason. She is the angriest young lady I have ever met in my entire life. She was just angry. She kind of walked around in a storm cloud. Then there was Josh. Now, Josh was very interesting because Josh had an imaginary friend, Bernie. And Bernie had to have his own chair. Josh would not sit anybody, and he had to have a chair for Bernie because Bernie was very smart. And Bernie would tell him the answers. And then Bernie would write them down in the book in invisible ink. Okay, and then I had Matthias. Matthias was Polish. I genuinely had no idea whether he spoke any English or not because he identified as a dog. So Matthias, he would sit underneath the table and he would communicate by bark and woof, which I can genuinely say I'd never come across before or since. He had come from a Polish orphanage where he'd been put because his mother couldn't afford to feed him. His dad had then rescued him. He'd been brought to England by his dad, and then he'd been excluded from 3 schools previous to ours because they couldn't cope with him being a dog. And the one thing that these students all had in common was that they absolutely didn't trust me. They didn't trust me. They didn't trust anybody in authority. They did not trust the school. They did not trust each other. There was a singular lack of trust. Enter me. So they gave me this class because I'm an AST. Now that means super teacher. That means I've instantly got all of the knowledge in the entire world about how to teach these kids. The cape was to save the educational world, and I was just supposed to come in and get them C's at English GCSE. I'm going to be honest, I couldn't do it. So the first class, I was introduced to the children. I'd read their IEPs. I knew that this was a troubled class. So they had no equipment. This was pretty normal for Hull, so that's no problem. I gave them some equipment. Matthias bit the pen in 2, and then he retreated back under his table. Josh wouldn't touch it because it had germs, and he had a real thing about germs. Sophie, the angry Sophie, did a look. That look which makes you think she wants you to die right there on the spot. Bartosz did try, but remember, he's got no English. He has no clue what I'm saying. Katja's happy. She's got a new pen. She can put it in her beautiful pencil case. And she did write the date. But this was it for 90 minutes. That's all I did, was get them to write the date down, because I couldn't do anything else. So I could have been the teacher who just sat there, got paid, let them get on with it, let them fail. But that's not me. So after crying for a little bit, I will confess, I'd sat down and thought, how am I going to solve these kids? And we bring it back to Maslow. And this was to do with my own metacognition. Everything I'd been taught at university did not work with these children. Just didn't. I had nothing. So I went back and thought, okay, what do I need to do to support these children? So first of all, they all came from extreme circumstances. So I made sure every morning they had free breakfast. So they were fed, because not all of them had food security. For some of them, their school uniform was kept at school, and I made sure it was washed. And I made their classroom a safe space. So nobody was allowed in my classroom apart from them, and I can be quite fierce, and I kept everybody out. And I turned up to school every single day, whether I was ill, whether I'd broken my leg, every single day I came to school because I was their safety and I was their person. So once I'd fixed their lower levels of need in the immediate term, there were some things I couldn't fix and required social services, but I liaised between those people as well. Then I had to think about, I fixed the bottom layer of Maslow. What do I do next? And this is what put me on the current path I'm on. So I'm going to introduce you to balloon theory. Now, I want you to imagine all of our brains start off like a deflated balloon, like this. And what we do as teachers is we give people knowledge and we inflate the balloon. But it's not quite simple, not quite as easy as that. Because theoretically, the more technology, the more teaching that happens, the more you could learn, the bigger your balloon goes. Simple. Except, not all balloons are made equal. Some balloons are small balloons, like a water balloon, and are easy to inflate. Some balloons are like those big, enormous gas-filled balloons and are really, really hard to inflate. So these children had deflated balloons. They were being taught, but they were being taught that parents can hurt you. If you don't speak English, you can't get stuff and nobody can understand you. They were taught that the world was unfair, and they were taught some extreme, harsh realities of life. And I was doing my master's at the time as well, so I was also investigating deprivation and the effects of deprivation. And I came across Sue Palmer, who I worked with for a little bit. And Sue Palmer came up with this concept of toxic childhood. And I want you to think of toxic childhood as being like the skin of a balloon, like the membrane of a balloon. Now, outdoor play, children use outdoor play all the way through. They play football on the streets, they play cricket on the streets here. You know, they play. They play without adult supervision. They explore, they find release, they find freedom, and they find independence. Yet, Save the Children have shown that 27% of children in the UK play outside now, compared to 80% of people my age. So I was allowed to play, they are not. And this has also increased obesity and mental health issues because they have nowhere to go with it. There's the commercialisation of childhood. So they are consumers. Anybody who has small children knows that they put on cartoons and they want stuff immediately. So they're becoming consumers. They're not allowed to make their own stuff and to play and use their imagination. There's the schoolification of childhood. So there's the expectation that children learn at standardized paces. There's pressure on parents for A grades. In September 2024, the government announced that from then, all children in the UK will go to school for 6.5 hours. So that's 32.5 hours a week. Where is their time to learn an instrument? Where is their time to play? Where is their time for sport? Where is their time just to be? So because of this schoolification of childhood, they are losing all of the things that we, as adults, found precious. There's also communication, huge. We all know in companies, if your communication isn't there, then as a company, you're pretty much done. And children, the children who are behind in reading in England and Wales last year increased to 1.9 million. So there's 1.9 million children who are behind their expected reading age in England and Wales. That's up from 1.7 million last year. It's growing. And this, on top of that, we've got screen saturation. The government did a study in 2020 which showed 10 to 16-year-olds spend 60% of 10 to 16-year-olds spend more than 5 hours a day online. So they're in school for 6.5 hours and they're on social media for 5 hours. What is happening to our children? And yes, you know, the social contacts is very important for them, but blue light from their phone disrupts their sleep. Insomnia is on the increase, and sleep is crucial to process those working memories into long-term memories. They come to school tired, they come to school cross, they come to school with a lack of attention because they haven't had enough sleep. How are they supposed to learn? And then finally, tests, target, and education. I could talk for a very long time about the testing evils of the UK. However, there has been a narrowing of the curriculum. People have to jump through hoops to get them through exams rather than teaching them skills. And the increase of anxiety amongst all children worldwide is, quite frankly, appalling. These are failures of us as adults to protect our children and to make their balloon thin. And then we had COVID. And COVID has pretty much impacted everything. Absenteeism across the world now is endemic. In the UK, absenteeism used to be at 2% for secondary schools. Absenteeism is now at 25%. It's huge. And if we look here, 43% of students did not return to school when Liberia reopened. That's nearly half of their children did not go back. And if you're a girl, that affects you even more. As parents, we are now 80% more likely to let our children miss school because we're used to it. Before, we were used to sending them. Now we're used to them being home. And COVID has also increased anxiety and social anxiety tenfold. In the US, students were 5 months behind in reading and 4 months behind in maths. If you are of colour, increase that to 6 months. Yet in Sweden, there was no effect at all on reading or writing. So a lot of this depends upon who you are, where you were born, and into what socioeconomic status you were born. And how does this affect the learning balloon? It makes it thicker and thicker, so it's harder for us as teachers to get that learning through. Now, my wonderful assistant is going to hand you all a balloon. I've got more as well. I'm always prepared. But I don't want you to tie it. I want you to hold the end. So as I said before, some are easy, some are difficult, but we can all get it to here. Now, if you do this, and I'm going to keep hold of it, imagine that's COVID, or imagine that's you've moved to a new country, or imagine as a parent you put too much pressure on them, or the child isn't safe, or the child is hungry, or there is an event in their life. That is what happens to a child. An event changes them. Now, for some children who come from safe and loving homes, you can blow it up again, and it's easy. But for some children who have had that layer of trauma, it's going to be even more difficult to blow up the balloon again. So I'm going to blow this up again, and I'm going to tie it this time. So my class from Hull had the thickest, toxic, nastiest layer of a balloon, outer membrane, that you could ever imagine. But that's not just the end of the story. Now, I couldn't get hold of one of these, but I want you to imagine, you know those big party balloons where you have small balloons inside big balloons? In terms of learning, these small balloons within the bigger balloons are cognition, intelligence, epistemology, emotion, motivation, and communication. And what these little balloons do is that they can expand and they support and can push out the membrane of the bigger balloon. Okay, so I want us to think. Cognition is that information processing. It's knowledge acquisition, it's the higher order processing, it's social cognition, it's emotional cognition. Intelligence is just that. There is a layer of hereditary, and there is IQ is quite contentious, but all schools measure potential to a certain extent. We certainly do. We use CAT scores to measure where a child's potential is. Then you have epistemology. Now, this is a very fancy word, and what that basically means is what does a child believe about education and themselves. So if you are from Hull and you are a boy and you are white working class, you believe that education is not for you, and you believe that it's too cool to be at school and do well. However, for instance, if you are from a different family, if you are from a middle-class family and you are a girl, for instance, you believe that doing well and going to university is really important and matters to you. These are important. Our self-beliefs and our own framing of our learning is hugely important. Motivation. Then, emotions, I'll go back to those. You cannot learn if you are upset. You can't. It is impossible. You cannot learn if you are overexcited. You cannot learn if your attention is captured over there because you've just fallen out with your friend, or there's a snowstorm, or a bee, or it's rain, or the air conditioning's broken, or it's too hot. You cannot learn if your attention is over here. You cannot learn as well if your working memory is impaired because you're tired, or you haven't had enough to eat. There's also a stress response. You've fallen out with somebody in the playground. You've come back up the stairs. You can't learn if you are stressing about that's just gone off. You cannot learn if you have impaired self-regulation because you do not understand how to be in a classroom and how to behave. And you'll also irritate your teacher quite a lot. And then we have motivation, and this is the spark which gets students excited. We all have off days, that's fine. But for the vast majority of days, the students who do well, regardless of intelligence, have to have that intrinsic motivation. They have to want to do well. And this is what helps us process. And then finally, communication. Communication opens doors to a new level of learning. It means that a child can ask questions and ask the right questions from their teacher. It opens these channels with the teachers. And so if you cannot communicate in the language, then you cannot ask for the things that you need. Now, I'm going to skip through the sciencey bit. But they all work together as a circuit. And basically, for those, electronic neurons are passed from a stimulus into the working memory, which are encoded into long-term memory. That's basically how it works. So, and they, again, all work together to force that outer balloon so that it becomes thinner and easier to learn. Now, I'm going to do something. I'm going to give you a trigger warning, people. I'm about to burst the balloon. If one of these balloons does not work, the entire circuit does not work. If they cannot speak English or the language of teaching, they cannot learn. All they're focusing on is gaining the English. But if we support all the inner balloons, we further stretch the outer balloon and we minimize that toxicity of childhood and therefore supercharge the learning. So let's go back to my lovely class. How did I manage it? Because I did. It took me a year, I might add, but it worked. So, these were the inner balloons you can see that the children really focused on, or I needed to focus on for them. And I might say that when I'm walking into a classroom now, I'm not just looking in terms of what the child needs. Learning-wise, I'm looking at what the child needs emotionally as well to support them grow that balloon. Now, Katya and Bartosz, it turns out they can both, Russian is used as a lingua franca in Lithuania, and everybody learns Russian. So Katya started teaching Bartosz how to speak English through Russian. And Matthias, it turns out, understood Russian. I don't know how they found out, but the kids found out that they could all speak a version of Russian. And they developed this sort of Russian English, where some Russian, some Polish, some Lithuanian, and they all talked together, including the lovely Sophie. She learnt an entirely new language which will be useless for her for the rest of ever, but she did it. Josh. Now, Josh was interesting. Libby would be about 3 at the time, so I thought, how would I deal with Libby? So he doesn't like germs, and he's quite OCD. So what I did was I got a magic invisible spray. So what I did for Josh was I got my magic invisible spray and I sprayed where he would work. I sprayed him, I sprayed the desk, I sprayed his pencils, he had a special pencil case, I sprayed his books, I sprayed everything with the magic permanent anti-germ spray. And his imaginary friend, Bernie, we can't forget him. Bernie was very good, I quite like Bernie. What I did for Bernie was, because Bernie was smart, he sat an English test. Invisible ink, obviously. And Bernie did really well, and so I moved him to the setup. Matthias, the lovely, lovely Matthias. I treat trained him. So I bribed him with biscuits. So first, I bribed him with biscuits so that he would sit at the table. And that did well. And then I bribed him with praise. And basically, I caught him doing anything good, smiling. Oh, that's a beautiful smile, Matthias. That's amazing. So I treat trained him. He identified as a dog. I ran with it. And it's strangely enough, by the end of the year, the dog had gone. And it was Matthias who was talking to me in the classroom. Now, Sophie needed to be safe. Sophie was a bit more hardcore. Sophie was super, super smart. Sophie just didn't want to be very smart at all because she was also a very pretty girl, and she realised that you got more boyfriends if you were stupid. And that took some overcoming. So we needed to change the perceptions of her. And so I gave her one of my books. I gave her Pride and Prejudice. And then I told her it was far too hard for her and she couldn't read it. And because at that point she hated me lots, she read it anyway and then proceeded to tell me why it was a stupid book and that Mr. Darcy should be hung. So, fair enough. So in terms of metacognition, this was not really, the kids' metacognition became more and more important because metacognition couldn't happen until the balloon had been solved, until they felt safe enough and they felt able to learn. The cognition in the classroom was mine. I had to change everything. I had to change my own thinking. I had to change my own training. It was mine. So, I want all the parents in the room to think, how are you supporting your child in a balloon? Are you creating a more toxic environment at home, which is making it more difficult to learn, or are you supporting them? You need to, and we as educators need to thin the outer balloons and support those inner balloons. That is what we need to do. But there is a happy ending because I'm an English teacher after all. The happy ending is Sophie got 10 GCSEs at grade A star for her English to C. She went on to do A-levels. She's at university to read English. She's now teaching in Hull. Bartosz, 9 GCSEs at grades B to D. Katja got her C grades, and she's now happily married to an accountant. Matthias got C's and D's, and he was able to take an apprenticeship and is a mechanic. Josh got 10 GCSEs, all grade A to C, did A-levels, went to university to study engineering, and is currently working as an engineer. And that is my most difficult class. Right, has anybody got any questions before we dive into the next panel? Obviously. Mm. Yes. Sue Palmer. In my humble opinion, I think it makes the childhood much more toxic because school is for school. And as we found out from Miss Michaela over the weekend, the whole thing about learning through play is that at foundation stage, the learning is directed by the child, not the teacher. She is literally the antidote to schoolifying education. And that's what our foundation stage do. Then we come, like an A grade doesn't make you a better person. Doing maths for 5 hours doesn't make you a better person. It makes you stressed and it makes you tired, which means we come into a cycle where they've been learning far too much using their brains at home. They've been learning far too much. They come into school, they're tired. They can't learn the stuff at school, which means they need tutoring, which means, and it's on and on and on we go. And it's a merry-go-round. And this is why all of us do not believe in tutoring, especially if the tutors not teaching the same methodology as we are here, because it counteracts. So not only are you supporting the toxic childhood, but you're also supporting a child getting two sets of conflicting information. So rather than help those synapses develop and the memories develop, you're actually hindering it. And that's a problem. Any more? Okay. Okay, well, thank you very much for that. I think we're going to roll straight into a panel about metacognition. I believe Maria, I brought my youngest daughter, I brought my daughter up as well. So the reason we look familiar is intentional. So I'll just check who I need. So Libby, Maria, and I think Frank as well. I'll just check I'll just move all the burst balloons out of the way. Yeah, for those of you who don't know, I kind of talk about metacognition a lot. Yeah, a little bit. Little bit. You know, like pretty much all the time. Yeah, sorry about that. So this is my favorite thing. And I think particularly with AI, because what I didn't talk about in the talk is it doesn't actually matter who is filling the balloon or what is filling the balloon. What I'm talking about is those processes which allow the balloon to be filled, and metacognition is extremely important. So I'm going to start with Libby, actually. What do you know, because you came through the British school system and then moved abroad, so what do you know about thinking in school from you being little up until now?
Well, from any assessment thing that we did, whether it was in class just writing something in English or doing something like Big Maths Beat That, we always did peer assessment and self-assessment so that we were able to reflect on our and others' work and see what gaps we needed to fill.
Okay, thank you, Libby. Maria, you obviously teach German at the moment to the small people, and you do an awful lot of work on metacognition. So, you know, how do you understand metacognition within teaching German as a foreign language as well?
All right. I do really love metacognition. It's one of my research interests, to be honest. And I look at it in a more abstract way, to be honest. I look at that first part, like meta. What is meta? It's beyond, right? It's bringing education, it's bringing thinking and learning beyond what we used to think before, right? So it's thinking about how we think, thinking about how we learn, and optimizing those processes. So metacognition for me is optimizing our time, because that's the most precious thing we have. Like how in that small amount of time every day, we can make the best learning happen possible as teachers and as students. Yeah.
And Frank, I mean, you're principal head teacher, so how do you see it as part of the whole school ethos?
Well, it's very problematic because most teachers are more bound to their curriculum and they do their one thing. And So there are two ways to try to approach metacognition in a school. One is to try to bring different themes of curriculum together by having teachers work jointly on something. So we do global perspectives, and you have the math teachers and the science teachers and the history teachers together. But that has its limited effects because they approach organizing it the way they normally would approach organizing their traditional class. Another aspect is try to develop assessments that can reach metacognition. That can become very difficult if you have teachers who believe that the only way to assess is through past papers and don't see knowledge beyond the fact that acquiring knowledge can happen outside of a paper or through a past paper regime. So really, it is really very much of a challenge. Even when you have curriculums, like say if you're an NYP, PYP, or NYP school, that would in theory embrace these things. In practice, it can be very difficult. So it does require workshops for it requires teachers actually having teacher agency. Not me standing in front of the teachers telling them what metacognition is, because they're not going to listen to that, is to actually try to get the teachers together and have them work in planning and try to develop that, and then, you know, respond to it by a presentation, say within staff meetings. It is a real challenge. For younger teachers, less so. But really, it is a challenge. Really, it is.
No, I completely agree, especially when you're not used to using these skills as well. And you know, the training that we all have is the training that we all have, but it still sometimes does act as a cage. But so, I'm going to also ask. So you said you talked about teacher agency. So how do you think we can promote student agency as well for their own metacognition?
Well, in theory, to promote student agency would really lead to metacognition because the kids themselves bring those together. That's why in schools that are doing IB diploma, that's why there was a theory of knowledge. That course was developed almost 50 years ago specifically to promote a metacognitive approach. So, but then here becomes the issue is to have student agency, some teachers would see that would affect teacher agency. That can be in lower grades. I think you could somewhat more address it because at least before they're into the GCSEs, the curriculums are much more skill-based and content-based without so much summative assessments. But when you get into summative assessment regimes like in Cambridge or A-level or IB diploma, then what starts to happen is student agency is going to get in the way of me delivering the curriculum. So to promote the students, what you really have to do is I think teachers have to understand how students learn, but another of that problem is for teachers, especially if you are an older teacher, kids learn a bit differently today than they did when I was a young teacher, like I said that earlier. And I think even kids today are a bit, I know teachers who have been teaching for 15 years and they can see the changes. So I think for teachers to understand that agency, teachers have to promote that agency. They have to understand how the students sort of think. And you have to create an environment also that gives agency. If you have a school in which the school is run like it's a correctional institute, then you're never going to have anybody having agency. But if you allow your students the freedom to say things, if you allow students to question rules, if you allow students to question teachers, then you're to some extent promoting that. But it's easy to say that, but to do it is complicated.
No, I completely agree. Maria, you have the small ones as well. So student agency is easy, more difficult. And
yeah, I believe I completely agree with you that we should create the environment which allows metacognition to happen. And I think that is possible with gradual relief of responsibility. You know, when you begin to act as a teacher, you install those small practices like of activating prior knowledge, or think, pair, share, and you actually ask them to do that. But slowly and steadily, you give that agency to them. To with activating prior knowledge, you come to the room, and there is no question of you putting what did we do last class? It's them telling you, okay, Miss Maria, we did that and that. Like, can we carry on from that? So it's like slowly and gradually you releasing yourself from telling them what to do and them being in charge of their own learning, because they saw it happening before so many times and it's already on automatic regime, so to say, right?
yeah, so the routinized, the metacognitive routines, introduced into learning are very important. Now, Libby, you're doing IB, and that's an awful lot of you and not very much me. In fact, this is the first time I haven't taught you in 4 years, so yeah, that's nice. So what do you do in terms of thinking about your own thinking and improving your own work? You know, what do you do to help that, and what support do you need from your teachers?
I think to look at my own work before I ask for support is to do what I've been taught through my primary learning, in that I try to read it like I think a teacher would read it like, and look at all of the gaps that I can see. And then I will try to improve upon those. But I think the most support that I would need from a teacher is then to look at that and give me even more gaps to look at and see how I can improve, as well as saying what I did well to be able to continue to use that. Because with some marking where it's just tick and cross, it doesn't really tell you how to get better at that.
Have you used ChatGTP to help yet? Because one of the things that I was doing was using Brisk to help students get feedback, which is it's an AI app. So have you tried using that yet?
I use it sometimes to look over my essays to see if something could be phrased more differently or would sound better, but I don't use it as my primary source of help.
Good. I have taught you well, young Padawan. Okay, next question. So, how do we as educators support students who struggle with metacognition? How can we support them? We've talked about routines as well, but how can we support individual students, you know, either in the classroom or through school? I'll start with Maria.
That's a very interesting question, Stephanie. And I think that's why we are talking about metacognition in general, because it's about adaptive teaching, right? It's about every individual student and how they are doing and what support they need. And I think here I would mention like building relationships with your students, like knowing each and every student and what their emotional needs are and where they are in their academic progress. And as you said, like, you know, decoding every student, like you said, with your tough class, right? So you said, I don't remember which phrase you used, but it was like not analyzing, but something like deciphering, you know, your class and seeing where are those places where you can provide support to them, like seeing whether it's a student maybe dealing with more emotional challenges with their friends and all. So it's about knowing your students and knowing where to support, like, you know, and again, through those established metacognitive routines, when they are common routines for everyone, I believe then those students who are struggling, when the whole group is doing something, sometimes even the kids who are struggling, they are also joining in and they are taking something from it. And the more those metacognitive routines are in place in a classroom, the more it is helping the struggling students. I believe so, yeah.
I agree. Frank?
Well, I'll turn the question upside down. I think first the teacher has to understand what metacognition is, and that is sometimes half the problem. I think students by their nature are metacognitive thinkers. They're going through the different subjects every single day and they're making connections. The problem is sometimes the teachers don't realize that. Now, another case where the students are not, say the teacher has an understanding of how metacognitive thought can work in their class, but they're not seeing it happening. First is, I think teachers have to make education relevant to the student. They, especially now, because I'm a senior teacher, so I teach IB diploma, sixth form teacher. So you tend to get so busy on teaching the content, and sometimes you take the content out of practicality of what's happening in the world today, or things that they would know. So sometimes you have to bring that in. Also, you have to have a very interactive classroom with active learning going on, and not passive learning going on. And if you are allowing students that freedom to work through activities, to either work together or on their own, and to allow those discussions happening, you'll be able to bring that out. And like you've said before, the students that might be struggling can be brought up by, by their interactions with their peers, because their peers can understand them much better sometimes than we adults can, just like something you said earlier about the dreadful tuitions and all that. But I will give you one bit of advice. If you ever really need math tuition for your kid, do not get a math tuition person. Just get another student, because you'll be surprised how they will do a brilliant job about that, actually. But so that's I think it needs to start with the teachers having that understanding, and then having an interactive class that is activity-based, that promotes discussions and thoughts, at least depending on the curriculum. And the teacher has to realize that continual, if I just give one example, okay?
No, you go for
Sorry. I'm a history teacher, but I also teach economics. And about 25 years ago, I started to teach economics because I said, I can teach it, right? And I noticed something after a couple of years. My economics students were getting higher grades than my history students. And first I thought it's because econ is easier. No, it isn't. No. I realized what it was. I was not an economist. I was always one chapter ahead of my kids. My classes were much more bidirectional. My kids were doing more active learning. I was putting them in groups. I had to make the theory practical for me to understand it, so I had to make it practical for them. But history, I was an historian, so it was a speech from the throne, and I wasn't actually engaging those students as much as I was my econ students, because I didn't actually have the expertise. So I had to depend as a teacher on pedagogy and use the students as my partners. And it took me a long time to realize that. And I realized that's why they actually were getting higher grades, not because econ's easier than history, that's absurd, but because the classes were developing metacognitive thought.
I agree with you, actually. I taught a maths class, which, for you guys who know me, that was hard. But I taught a maths class and every single child got an A or an A star, not because of me. I can really say it wasn't because of me, it's because I can't do maths. So because I can't do maths, I had to get the good students who could do maths to be my angels and teach all the rest of them the strategies. And I could get so far. I could get about 3/4 of the way, particularly with surds, but I couldn't get all the way. So the kids were like, "Oh, it's funny, Mrs. Holt again. Oh, she's been a bit daft." And they'd take the pen off me and they'd teach the rest of the class. But because they did that, they all got A stars because they all knew it.
And you must have used think alouds and all, right? So when you show them your thought process, you show them how you reached from point A to point B, and they're like, okay, Miss Stephanie did it that way, so I can also try. And that's an amazing metacognitive technique. Yeah.
And our final question, and I'll go for you, Libby, first. How you're coming towards, you're starting IB, you're going to university. So how do you think that thinking about thinking is going to help you for the future to get the exam results that you need? 7s. And then no pressure, and I'm thinning that balloon. But how are you going to get the results that you need to go to the university that you want to?
I think it's important that with my own learning, I'm doing what I know that I need to do. Rather than going to do extra classes or something after school to look at everything and then to have all of my my security with that subject broken down because it's been explained to me in a different way, for me to take what I have learned at school and then reflect upon what I do well, what I struggle with, what I can then do to help with what I struggle with, so that then I can build up my knowledge in a more constructive way and productive way, so that I have more time to myself and more time to rest, because IB's quite a rigorous thing anyway. I mean, it's just started and already my entire year is so exhausted with everything. And I think that making sure that I have a learning pattern that is productive and gives me the time to rest is very important with that. And also my ability to be able to quickly take out what I need to do in order to do that, because I know quite a lot of people who struggle with looking at their own work and seeing how to see what they've done right and wrong with that.
Thank you. All right.
Future of metacognition, Maria.
Future of metacognition. As my mentor, Ms. Stephanie Holt, told me once, it's a hot topic. You should catch it. No, but I do believe that this is a future of education. This is just like, you know, in a very concise manner, it shows you how to progress in a more productive way, how to learn in a more productive way, how to make that learning process, you know, that engagement and that information, that engagement with information, how to bring it from your working memory into your long-term memory in a more productive and useful way. And I think metacognition is that bridge, you know, that will help us learn faster, develop skills in a more efficient way. And especially in schools, like if you look at it in a classroom, I feel that metacognitive techniques really make it interactive, make it engaging, make it, you know, interesting for the students to be in that classroom. And I noticed in my own practice, the more I do it, sometimes I come with a checklist to my classroom and I put all the metacognitive techniques and I go and tick, you know, put a tick mark of like, what did I do today? And I notice like how time flies, you know, like they are all engaged. I don't have to look, you know, go and take one student from the very long washroom break. And I don't have to like, you know, see some other chatting. It's actually when you use those techniques, your classes become, your teaching becomes more engaging, becomes more fun and enjoyable for students and for me as well. So I do believe that it's the way forward, using metacognitive techniques and actually thinking of how do we think, how do we learn, how do we teach. Yes.
Thank you. Frank?
Well, like I said earlier, metacognitive approaches to teaching is how education happened in human history until the dawn of the 19th century. So that is actually the natural way people have always learned. But when we got into an industrial age where we wanted to educate everyone and we wanted to make people cogs in the reel, in the wheels, we started to pigeonhole education and we took that away from most people. But now that we have IA and computers to do those mundane work, and because successes in the future are going to require people to think on more than one level, you're seeing a returning to metacognitive thought and metacognitive approaches, which I believe is actually natural. And I believe the natural process. And young people today, because young people today can gather knowledge much more quicker than my generation, and because they have so many sources of information, while sometimes we may say it can be negative, it can actually be very positive. The young people today are much better at going to different places for information than, say, other people's would have been. So I believe the future of metacognitive is there because it is part of human nature. It is the traditional way people actually were taught, and the needs of the future are going to require that way of thinking. And then I guess the fourth way is I think young people will be paving the way for us on that. And our teachers are getting younger. Yes.
Speak for yourself.
Ma'am, with respect, I could have been your high school teacher, okay?
I couldn't possibly comment. But thank you. I mean, I think for me, the reason I am so passionate about metacognition is because I can only see with the advent of AI that this is pretty much the only way forward, and that we have to support our students' social and emotional needs, because effectively as a teacher we are no longer the experts. The computer is, not us. What we are the experts at is kidology. We can look and we can read children and we can support children, and that is going to become more and more our role, and should be now anyway. We don't teach robots yet. You know, we teach living, breathing humans that we need to support, love and nurture and get them to the space that they need to be. So a big round of applause for my panelists. It was fascinating.